Let's temporarily forget what the press says about missiles and drones. Because in reality, every 7 minutes, another Israeli family decides to leave their homeland. Not necessarily because of rockets or sirens, but because they no longer see a future there. 70,000 migrants each year. 5 elections in just 4 years. The most brilliant minds of the startup nation are competing for a one-way ticket to Berlin or New York. And perhaps this is Israel's most bitter paradox. You create the most powerful chips on the planet, but you can't maintain a stable government for more than 12 months. When the elite flee, all that remains is an empty shell. So what is really happening? Why are more and more people, especially the most capable ones, no longer wanting to live in Israel? And is the 2028 deadline for a complete collapse still too far away? In this video, we will analyze why the current war is actually just a temporary life support device for a system that is cracking from within. Don't take your eyes off. If viewed from the outside, Israel does not look like a country in crisis. Tel Aviv remains one of the world's leading technology hubs. Startups continue to raise billions of dollars. The big corporations still set up offices here. The economy, on paper, is still growing, and the Israeli military is still considered one of the strongest forces in the region. Additionally, Israel still has a shield that not many countries possess: support from the United States, both financially, militarily, and diplomatically. All of that creates a very familiar image, a strong, modern nation that is still in control of the situation. But that very fact makes this story more concerning, because history shows countries rarely collapse when everything clearly looks bad. They collapse when everything seems fine on the surface. But the cracks have already begun to form within. And that is exactly what is happening in Israel. Those who leave are not the weakest, but those with the most options. Those who stay do not always do so because they want to, but because they have not been able to leave. Belief, the most important thing that keeps a society functioning, is gradually changing. Not everyone says it out loud, but more and more people are starting to think, is this still the best place to build a future? And when that question comes up often enough, it is no longer a personal question. It becomes a signal indicating that the issue is no longer just about war or the economy, but something much deeper: social structure, political system, and the sense of the future. So, what is really happening within that system? If there is one clear sign that a country is changing, it is not the confrontations nor the GDP, but rather, who is leaving? In Israel, about 70,000 people leave the country each year, and what is noteworthy is not the quantity, but the quality of the immigrants. They are members of the secular Jews group and high-tech experts, the backbone pillars nurturing the economy. When the elite choose to leave, it is no longer a typical migration, but a brain drain that directly affects the survival of the nation. The story of a software engineer in Tel Aviv is a typical example. Every month he receives a salary of $8,000, a dream figure anywhere. But in Israel, Avi is an upper-class poor person. After deducting the progressive income tax and the cost of living in the world's most expensive city, the remaining amount is not enough for him to pay off a mortgage on a 2-bedroom apartment built in the 1960s. In Tel Aviv, real estate prices have increased by more than 200% over the past decade, creating an insurmountable financial barrier. Would you be willing to dedicate 12 hours a day to genius lines of code, while even a decent roof over your head has become a luxury? This is the psychological breaking point. When success becomes an unbearable burden, people will choose to give up. The little-known truth is that the wealth gap in Israel is being exacerbated by the very boom in the technology sector. It creates a dual economy. One tier lives on the global USD, while the other struggles with the depreciating local shekel due to inflation. This contrast is so stark that you can see the shimmering blue glass skyscrapers casting their shadows over the dilapidated neighborhoods, where the infrastructure has deteriorated since half a century ago. If you feel that these analyses provide a different perspective compared to mainstream media, please subscribe to our channel to join us in deciphering the underground movements of the world. And then people like that tech engineer had to choose to leave, not out of fear of what is happening, but because they are too exhausted from shouldering exorbitant taxes to sustain an increasingly overloaded public system and perpetual political instability. They choose Berlin, Lisbon, or New York, not because they love those cities more than their homeland, but because those are places where their efforts are valued. Imagine a city as a living organism. These people are the circulatory system carrying energy, money, and ideas throughout the system. And now, that circulatory system is gradually withdrawing. Many young families are starting to ask very practical questions. Will their children grow up in a stable environment? Will this job still exist in the next 5 years? Should we keep the property here? These are not ideological questions. These are very mundane decisions, but when repeated enough, they create a trend. What is noteworthy is that this change is not loud. There are no throngs of migrants on the streets, no scenes of abandoned cities. Everything happens very quietly. Small changes, almost invisible, but when put together, they create a much larger picture. But there is one thing more important than who is leaving. That is, who is staying. Because in any system, collapse does not come from losing people but from the imbalance between those who leave and those who remain. And it is that very imbalance that is shaping the future of Israeli cities. In the next part, we will look at the population structure to understand why this story is not just about migration, but a much deeper change. We just talked about who is leaving Israel, and now let's look at a harder truth. Who is staying, and how are they changing the system? In Israel, there is a term that demographers always mention with trepidation: the demographic time bomb. As analyzed, while the tax-paying intellectual group is quietly leaving, on the other hand, another population group is growing at a rapid pace. That is the Haredi community, the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community. Currently, they make up about 20% of the Jewish population in Israel. But what is noteworthy is not just the ratio, but the growth rate. On average, each family in this group has about 6 to 6.5 children per woman, and they are expected to make up 1/3 of Israel's population by 2050. From a demographic perspective, this is a growth rate rarely seen in developed countries. Imagine a cart going uphill. The group of people pulling the cart is getting smaller and more exhausted, while the number of people sitting on the cart increases exponentially each year. This is not a religious issue, but a purely public finance problem. Most men in the Haredi community spend all their time studying the scriptures. They do not participate in the labor market and are especially exempt from military service, a contentious privilege in a country where security is paramount. How long can a system survive when 20% of the population bears 90% of the tax burden, while the fastest-growing group contributes almost nothing to the GDP? This mismatch creates distinct geographical rifts right in the heart of the cities. You can drive just 20 minutes from a modern Tel Aviv, where young people are grappling with startups and military service, to Bnei Brak, a place where time seems to have stopped in the 18th century. This contrast is not just in clothing, but in the rupture of value systems and civic responsibilities. If you want to gain a deeper understanding of the geopolitical paradoxes that few dare to analyze openly, don't forget to subscribe to the channel to join us on our next decoding journeys. And the implicit truth here is, the Israeli government has to pour billions of USD in subsidies each year to maintain political support from this voter bloc. That money should have been used to modernize the paralyzed subway system or to cool down housing prices for young people. When injustice becomes institutionalized, those who bear the burden will choose to let go. A system does not collapse due to a lack of people. It collapses due to the loss of balance between those who bear the burden and those who are supported. You don't need the system to collapse immediately. Just the basic parameters, labor, taxes, obligations, gradually deviating from the equilibrium state. The system will start to become unstable. And the noteworthy thing is, these changes do not happen in a year, but accumulate over many years, many generations. But the story doesn't stop at who pays taxes or who serves in the military. Population, though important, is still just a part of the picture, because even a system with a skewed population can still operate if the rest is stable enough. The problem is, in Israel, that very remainder, the political system, is also showing its own signs of instability. And when these two factors combine, the story starts to become much more complicated. Why can't a country of brilliant minds have a stable government for more than 12 months? We will step into the maze of Israel's political system in the next part. If the population is the foundation, then the political system is the skeleton of a nation. And in Israel, that skeleton is starting to show cracks. To form a government, a coalition needs at least 61 out of the total 120 seats in the Knesset. Sounds simple. But in reality, this forces the parties to build very fragile alliances where each small group can become the decisive vote. Imagine a table with too many legs, but each leg belongs to a different person. Just one person pulling out. The whole system will tilt. And that has happened not just once, but repeatedly. In the span of 4 years, Israel has held 5 national elections. A cycle that theoretically should last 4 years keeps ending after just 1-2 years, or even shorter. This model has almost become a loop. Alliance disagreement collapse, election repeat. Some analysts call this state chronic political instability. And when a system has to be reset continuously, it not only incurs financial costs, but also erodes the ability to plan for the long term. The interesting and also the less talked about aspect is how small groups can shape policy. In a system that requires 61 seats, sometimes just 5-6 seats are enough to create significant negotiating power. That means important decisions do not always reflect an absolute majority, but rather the result of very complex compromises. A former official once described this system as a survival alliance where the primary goal is not reform, but the preservation of the government's existence. This feeling gradually seeps into everyday life. When the government changes continuously, policies change accordingly. Businesses are delaying investments, people are postponing major decisions, and a question is starting to arise more and more. Is this system stable enough to build a long-term future? If you see these pieces starting to connect, you can subscribe to the channel because the next part will take us to an even more significant paradox. Because there is something very noteworthy. With such a level of instability, this system should have collapsed a long time ago, but it is still standing. So what is holding it back? If you look back at the whole picture from the beginning of the video until now, the imbalanced population, the exodus of people, the unstable political system, there is a very natural question. Why haven't all these things led to a clear collapse yet? The answer may lie in a factor that is often overlooked from this perspective: war. In political science, there is a concept called external threat cohesion. When an external threat emerges, it can temporarily reduce internal conflicts. In other words, when a society faces an existential threat, internal differences are often put on hold to prioritize unity. This has happened in many countries, and Israel is no exception. In the context of war, fragile political alliances can become more stable, at least in the short term. Previous disagreements are set aside, elections may be postponed, controversial decisions are temporarily postponed. Some analysts describe this as a state of political suspension, where the system does not actually resolve issues, but merely temporarily avoids facing them. This leads to a rather uncomfortable paradox. War, something often seen as a destructive force, can also play a role as a mechanism for temporary stability. Like a patient being kept alive by life support, the indicators are still there, but the root cause has not been addressed. Of course, this perspective is not an absolute consensus. Some opinions suggest that war is merely a reaction to security threats. But there are also other viewpoints questioning whether the prolonged state of conflict inadvertently creates a buffer that helps the system avoid changing too quickly. If you find this approach helps to view the issue from multiple angles, you can subscribe to the channel as we are trying to delve into layers of analysis that are often overlooked in quick news updates. But there is something even more important. If the conflicts stop, what will happen next? Because when this buffer disappears, the system will have to face directly all the pressures that have been postponed. And that's when the story is no longer about conflict, but about the very survival of the internal system itself. We often mistakenly think that the collapse of a nation will be like a seismic event shaking the earth. But history has proven the opposite. The collapse is actually a sigh. It is a silent process of decay, beginning the moment people stop believing that tomorrow will be better than today. At first, no one noticed. Then a few people started leaving. Then, more people began to ask questions. In the cities of Israel, the so-called Jewish dream is gradually fading in the silence of empty apartments and closed business streets. When faith, the invisible thread connecting individuals to the destiny of the nation, breaks, even the most solid fortresses become mere hollow shells. Let's look at a reality that few people mention: the erosion of social cohesion. When a large segment of the population feels that their contributions are ignored and their future is gambled away by political games, they will no longer want to continue. A comment on forums in Israel once caused a stir. 2028 might be an overly distant forecast. We are witnessing the end right here, right now. This is not the lament of a failure, but the bitter awakening of a generation. What will you do when you realize that the country you are defending can no longer protect your child's dreams? Israel is facing an existential crisis on a spiritual level. Infrastructure systems can be repaired, public debt can be restructured, but when trust in a common future is lost, people will choose to leave quietly. And each family that leaves, each technology company that relocates abroad, is a brick pulled from the foundation of the nation. The cities of Israel will perhaps not collapse due to a lack of money. They collapse due to a lack of hope. The collapse happens daily at dinner tables, where young people discuss obtaining a second passport, or in startup companies where people calculate the buyout value to escape the system. A country does not collapse in a day. It collapses when its best no longer consider it home. This truth leads us to a bigger question, a question we have posed since the beginning of the video. Is there still a chance to repair a system that has been so deeply fractured? Or are we all simply observers of a collapse that has been predetermined? We will move into the conclusion to find the answer to the most pressing question of this century. So, after all that we have just analyzed, a question comes back, simple but not easy to answer. Is Israel really collapsing? The answer, perhaps, does not lie in a yes or no. Israel is not a building that will collapse overnight. It is like a system under pressure from multiple sides, like a bridge still standing, but the load-bearing points are starting to become overloaded. 70,000 people leave every year. A political system that constantly needs to be restructured. A population structure is changing in an unpredictable direction. None of these factors are sufficient to cause an immediate collapse. But when they coexist, they put the system into a state that experts call high structural stress. So, the question may no longer be, will Israel collapse? But rather, can this system self-correct and adapt before the pressure exceeds the limit? If you're interested in this kind of analysis, subscribe to the channel because each video here is an effort to delve deeper, slower, and understand better what is really happening behind the headlines. And as always, the final answer perhaps lies in how each of us interprets these signals. And an important note: this video does not aim to assert an absolute conclusion or make a certain prediction about the future. This is a synthesis and analysis from various data sources, academic perspectives, and observed trends. Reality is always more complex than any single story, and what is happening continues to change day by day. Therefore, perhaps the most important thing is not whether to believe or not, but how we observe, ask questions, and understand the signals that are emerging. Thank you for staying with us until the end. See you in the next videos.